Chapter 2 of A Phantom Lover by Vernon Lee. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I feel that I cannot possibly reconstruct my earliest impressions of Mrs. Oke. My recollection of them would be entirely colored by my subsequent knowledge of her, whence I conclude that I could not at first have experienced the strange interest and admiration which that extraordinary woman very soon excited in me. Interest and admiration, be it well understood, of a very unusual kind, as she was herself a very unusual kind of woman. And I, if you choose, am a rather unusual kind of man. But I can explain that better anon. This much is certain, that I must have been immeasurably surprised at finding my hostess and future sitter so completely unlike everything I had anticipated. Or, no, now I come to think of it, I scarcely felt surprised at all. Or if I did, that shock of surprise could have lasted but an infinitesimal part of a minute. The fact is, that having once seen Alice Oke in the reality, it was quite impossible to remember that one could have fancied her at all different. There was something so complete, so completely unlike every one else, in her personality, that she seemed always to have been present in one's consciousness, although present, perhaps, as an enigma. Let me try and give you some notion of her. Not that first impression, whatever it may have been, but the absolute reality of her as I gradually learned to see it. To begin with, I must repeat and reiterate over and over again that she was, beyond all comparison, the most graceful and exquisite woman I have ever seen, but with a grace and an exquisiteness that had nothing to do with any preconceived notion or previous experience of what goes by these names. Grace and exquisiteness recognized at once as perfect, but which were seen in her for the first time, and probably, I do believe, for the last time. It is conceivable, is it not, that once in 1,000 years there may arise a combination of lines, a system of movements, an outline, a gesture, which is new, unprecedented, and yet hits off exactly our desires for beauty and rareness? She was very tall, and I suppose people would have called her thin. I don't know, for I never thought about her as a body, bones, flesh, that sort of thing, but merely as a wonderful series of lines, and a wonderful strangeness of personality. Tall and slender, certainly, and with not one item of what makes up our notion of a well-built woman. She was as straight, I mean she had as little of what people call figure, as a bamboo. Her shoulders were a trifle high, and she had a decided stoop. Her arms and her shoulders she never once wore uncovered. But this bamboo figure of hers had a suppleness and a stateliness, a play of outline with every step she took, that I can't compare to anything else. There was in it something of the peacock, and also something of the stag. But above all, it was her own. I wish I could describe her. I wish, alas! I wish, I have wished 100,000 times I could paint her as I see her now if I shut my eyes, even if it were only a silhouette. There, I see her so plainly, walking slowly up and down a room, the slight highness of her shoulders just completing the exquisite arrangement of lines made by the straight, supple back, the long, exquisite neck, the head with the hair cropped in short, pale curls, always drooping a little, except when she would suddenly throw it back and smile, not at me, nor at any one, nor at anything that had been said, but as if she alone had suddenly seen or heard something, with a strange dimple in her thin, pale cheeks, and the strange whiteness of her full, wide-opened eyes. the moment when she had something of the stag in her movement. But where is the use of talking about her? I don't believe, you know, that even the greatest painter can show what is the real beauty of a very beautiful woman in the ordinary sense. Titian's and Tintoretto's women must have been miles handsomer than they have made them. Something, and that the very essence, always escapes, perhaps because real beauty is as much a thing in time, a thing like music, a succession, a series, as in space. Mind you, I am speaking of a woman beautiful in the conventional sense. Imagine, then, how much more so in the case of a woman like Alice Oke. And if the pencil and brush, imitating each line and tint, can't succeed, how is it possible to give even the vaguest notion with mere wretched words, words possessing only a wretched abstract meaning, an impotent conventional association? To make a long story short, Mrs. Oke of Okehurst was, in my opinion, to the highest degree exquisite and strange, an exotic creature whose charm you can no more describe than you could bring home the perfume of some newly discovered tropical flower by comparing it with the scent of a cabbage rose or a lily. That first dinner was gloomy enough. Mr. Oke, Oke of Okehurst, as the people down there called him, was horribly shy, consumed with a fear of making a fool of himself before me and his wife, I then thought. But that sort of shyness did not wear off, and I soon discovered that, although it was doubtless increased by the presence of a total stranger, it was inspired in Oke not by me, but by his wife. He would look every now and then as if he were going to make a remark, and then evidently restrain himself and remain silent. It was very curious to see this huge, handsome, manly young fellow, who ought to have had any amount of success with women, suddenly stammer and grow crimson in the presence of his own wife. Nor was it the consciousness of stupidity, for when you got him alone, Oke, although always slow and timid, had a certain amount of ideas, and very defined political and social views, and a certain childlike earnestness and desire to attain certainty and truth, which was rather touching. On the other hand, Oke's singular shyness was not, so far as I could see, the result of any kind of bullying on his wife's part. You can always detect, if you have any observation, the husband or the wife who is accustomed to be snubbed, to be corrected by his or her better half. There is a consciousness in both parties, a habit of watching and fault-finding, of being watched and found fault with. This was clearly not the case at Okehurst. Mrs. Oke evidently did not trouble herself about her husband in the very least. He might say or do any amount of silly things without rebuke or even notice. And he might have done so, had he chosen, ever since his wedding day. You felt that at once. Mrs. Oke simply passed over his existence. I cannot say she paid much attention to anyone's, even to mine. At first I thought it an affectation on her part, for there was something far-fetched in her whole appearance, something suggesting study, which might lead one to tax her with affectation at first. She was dressed in a strange way, not according to any established aesthetic eccentricity, but individually strangely, as if in the clothes of an ancestress of the 17th century. While at first I thought it a kind of pose on her part, the mixture of extreme graciousness and utter indifference which she manifested towards me, she always seemed to be thinking of something else, and although she talked quite sufficiently, and with every sign of superior intelligence, she left the impression of having been as taciturn as her husband. In the beginning, in the first few days of my stay at Okehurst, I imagined that Mrs. Oke was a highly superior sort of flirt, and that her absent manner, her look, while speaking to you into an invisible distance, her curious, irrelevant smile, were so many means of attracting and baffling adoration. I mistook it for the somewhat similar manners of certain foreign women, it is beyond English ones, which mean, to those who can understand, pay court to me. But I soon found I was mistaken. Mrs. Oke had not the faintest desire that I should pay court to her; indeed, she did not honor me with sufficient thought for that; and I, on my part, began to be too much interested in her from another point of view to dream of such a thing. I became aware, not merely that I had before me the most marvellously rare and exquisite and baffling subject for a portrait, but also one of the most peculiar and enigmatic of characters. Now that I look back upon it, I am tempted to think that the psychological peculiarity of that woman might be summed up in an exorbitant and absorbing interest in herself, a Narcissus attitude, curiously complicated with a fantastic imagination, a sort of morbid daydreaming all turned inwards and with no outer characteristic save a certain restlessness, a perverse desire to surprise and shock more particularly her husband, and thus be revenged for the intense boredom which his presence evidently inflicted upon her. I got to understand this much little by little, yet I did not seem to have really penetrated the something mysterious about Mrs. Oke. There was a waywardness, a strangeness, which I felt but could not explain, a something as difficult to define as the peculiarity of her outward appearance, and perhaps very closely connected therewith. I became interested in Mrs. Oke as if I had been in love with her, and I was not in the least in love. I neither dreaded parting from her nor felt any pleasure in her presence. I had not the smallest wish to please or gain her notice. But I had her on the brain. I pursued her, her physical image, her psychological explanation, with a kind of passion which filled my days and prevented my ever feeling dull. The Okes lived a remarkably solitary life. There were but few neighbors, of whom they saw but little, and they rarely had a guest in the house. Oke himself seemed every now and then seized with a sense of responsibility towards me. He would remark vaguely, during our walks and after dinner chats, that I must find life at Okehurst horribly dull. His wife's health had accustomed him to solitude, and then, also, his wife thought the neighbors a bore. He never questioned his wife's judgment in these matters. He merely stated the case as if resignation were quite simple and inevitable. Yet it seemed to me sometimes that this monotonous life of solitude by the side of a woman who took no more heed of him than of a table or chair was producing a vague depression and irritation in this young man, so evidently cut out for a cheerful, commonplace life. I often wondered how he could endure it at all, not having, as I had, the interest of a strange psychological riddle to solve and of a great portrait to paint. He was, I found, extremely good, the type of the perfectly conscientious young Englishman, the sort of man who ought to have been the Christian soldier kind of thing. Devout, pure-minded, brave, incapable of any baseness, a little intellectually dense, and puzzled by all manner of moral scruples. The condition of his tenants and his political party, he was a regular Kentish Tory, lay heavy on his mind. He spent hours every day in his study, doing the work of a land agent and a political whip, reading piles of reports and newspapers and agricultural treatises, and emerging for lunch with piles of letters in his hand, and that odd, puzzled look on his good, healthy face, that deep gash between his eyebrows, which my friend, the mad doctor, calls the maniac frown. It was with this expression of face that I should have liked to paint him, but I felt that he would not have liked it, that it was more fair to him to represent him in his more wholesome pink and white blonde conventionality. I was, perhaps, rather unconscientious about the likeness of Mr. Oke. I felt satisfied to paint it no matter how, I mean as regards character, for my whole mind was swallowed up in thinking how I should paint Mrs. Oke, how I could best transport on to canvas that singular and enigmatic personality. I began with her husband, and told her frankly that I must have much longer to study her. Mr. Oke couldn't understand why it should be necessary to make 101 pencil sketches of his wife before even determining in what attitude to paint her. But I think he was rather pleased to have an opportunity of keeping me at Okehurst. My presence evidently broke the monotony of his life. Mrs. Oke seemed perfectly indifferent to my staying, as she was perfectly indifferent to my presence. Without being rude, I never saw a woman pay so little attention to a guest. She would talk with me sometimes by the hour, or rather let me talk to her, but she never seemed to be listening. She would lie back in a big 17th-century armchair while I played the piano, with that strange smile every now and then in her thin cheeks, that strange whiteness in her eyes, but it seemed a matter of indifference whether my music stopped or went on. In my portrait of her husband, she did not take, or pretend to take, the very faintest interest, but that was nothing to me. I didn't want Mrs. Oke to think me interesting. I merely wished to go on studying her. The first time that Mrs. Oke seemed to become at all aware of my presence, as distinguished from that of the chairs and tables, the dogs that lay in the porch, or the clergyman or lawyer or stray neighbor who was occasionally asked to dinner, was one day, I might have been there a week, when I chanced to remark to her upon the very singular resemblance that existed between herself and the portrait of a lady that hung in the hall with the ceiling like a ship's hull. The picture in question was a full length, neither very good nor very bad, probably done by some stray Italian of the early 17th century. It hung in a rather dark corner, facing the portrait, evidently painted to be its companion, of a dark man with a somewhat unpleasant expression of resolution and efficiency, in a black Vandyck dress. The two were evidently man and wife, and in the corner of the woman's portrait were the words, "Alice Oke, daughter of Virgil Pomfret, Esquire, and wife to Nicholas Oke of Okehurst," and the date 1626. Nicholas Oke being the name painted in the corner of the small portrait. The lady was really wonderfully like the present Mrs. Oke, at least so far as an indifferently painted portrait of the early days of Charles I can be like a living woman of the 19th century. There were the same strange lines of figure and face, the same dimples in the thin cheeks, the same wide-opened eyes, the same vague eccentricity of expression, not destroyed even by the feeble painting and conventional manner of the time. One could fancy that this woman had the same walk, the same beautiful line of nape of the neck and stooping head as her descendant, for I found that Mr. and Mrs. Oke, who were first cousins, were both descended from that Nicholas Oke, and that Alice, daughter of Virgil Pomfret. But the resemblance was heightened by the fact that, as I soon saw, the present Mrs. Oke distinctly made herself up to look like her ancestress, dressing in garments that had a 17th century look, nay, that were sometimes absolutely copied from this portrait. "You think I am like her," answered Mrs. Oke dreamily to my remark, and her eyes wandered off to that unseen something, and the faint smile dimpled her thin cheeks. "You are like her, and you know it. I may even say you wish to be like her, Mrs. Oke," I answered, laughing. "Perhaps I do." And she looked in the direction of her husband. I noticed that he had an expression of distinct annoyance besides that frown of his. "Isn't it true that Mrs. Oke tries to look like that portrait?" I asked, with a perverse curiosity. "Oh, fudge!" he exclaimed, rising from his chair and walking nervously to the window. "It's all nonsense, mere nonsense. I wish you wouldn't, Alice." "Wouldn't what?" asked Mrs. Oke, with a sort of contemptuous indifference. "If I am like that Alice Oke, why, I am, and I am very pleased any one should think so. She and her husband are just about the only two members of our family, our most flat, stale, and unprofitable family, that ever were in the least degree interesting." Oke grew crimson, and frowned as if in pain. "I don't see why you should abuse our family, Alice," he said. Thank God our people have always been honorable and upright men and women. Excepting always Nicholas Oke and Alice, his wife, daughter of Virgil Pomfret, Esquire, she answered, laughing, as he strode out into the park. How childish he is! She exclaimed when we were alone. He really minds, really feels disgraced by what our ancestors did 2 centuries and a half ago. I do believe William would have those 2 portraits taken down and burned if he weren't afraid of me and ashamed of the neighbors. And, as it is, these 2 people really are the only 2 members of our family that ever were in the least interesting. I will tell you the story some day. As it was, the story was told to me by Oke himself. The next day, as we were taking our morning walk, he suddenly broke a long silence, laying about him all the time at the sere grasses with a hooked stick that he carried, like the conscientious Kentishman he was, for the purpose of cutting down his and other folks' thistles. "I fear you must have thought me very ill-mannered towards my wife yesterday," he said shyly, "and indeed I know I was." Oke was one of those chivalrous beings to whom every woman, every wife, and his own most of all, appeared in the light of something holy. But, I have a prejudice which my wife does not enter into, about raking up ugly things in one's own family. I suppose Alice thinks that it is so long ago that it has really got no connection with us. She thinks of it merely as a picturesque story. I dare say many people feel like that. In short, I am sure they do. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such lots of discreditable family traditions afloat. But I feel as if it were all one whether it were long ago or not. When it's a question of one's own people, I would rather have it forgotten. I can't understand how people can talk about murders in their families, and ghosts, and so forth. "Have you any ghosts at Okehurst, by the way?" I asked. The place seemed as if it required some to complete it. "I hope not," answered Oke gravely. His gravity made me smile. "Why, would you dislike it if there were?" I asked. "If there are such things as ghosts," he replied, "I don't think they should be taken lightly. God would not permit them to be, except as a warning or a punishment." We walked on some time in silence, I wondering at the strange type of this commonplace young man, and half wishing I could put something into my portrait that should be the equivalent of this curious, unimaginative earnestness. Then Oke told me the story of those 2 pictures, told it me about as badly and hesitatingly as was possible for mortal man. He and his wife were, as I have said, cousins, and therefore descended from the same old Kentish stock. The Okes of Okehurst could trace back to Norman, almost to Saxon times, far longer than any of the titled or better known families of the neighborhood. I saw that William Oke, in his heart, thoroughly looked down upon all his neighbors. "We have never done anything particular, or been anything particular, never held any office," he said, "but we have always been here, and apparently always done our duty. An ancestor of ours was killed in the Scotch wars, another at Agincourt, mere honest captains. Well, early in the 17th century the family had dwindled to a single member, Nicholas Oke, the same who had rebuilt Okehurst in its present shape. This Nicholas appears to have been somewhat different from the usual run of the family. He had in his youth sought adventures in America, and seems, generally speaking, to have been less of a nonentity than his ancestors. He married, when no longer very young, Alice, daughter of Virgil Pomfret, a beautiful young heiress from a neighboring county. It was the first time an Oke married a Pomfret, my host informed me, and the last time. The Pomfrets were quite different sorts of people, restless, self-seeking. One of them had been a favorite of Henry VIII. It was clear that William Oke had no feeling of having any Pomfret blood in his veins. He spoke of these people with an evident family dislike, the dislike of an Oke, one of the old, honorable, modest stock, which had quietly done its duty for a family of fortune seekers and court minions. Well, there had come to live near Okehurst, in a little house recently inherited from an uncle, a certain Christopher Lovelock, a young gallant and poet, who was in momentary disgrace at court for some love affair. This Lovelock had struck up a great friendship with his neighbors of Okehurst, too great a friendship apparently with the wife, either for her husband's taste or her own. Anyhow, one evening, as he was riding home alone, Lovelock had been attacked and murdered, ostensibly by highwaymen, but, as was afterwards rumored, by Nicholas Oke, accompanied by his wife dressed as a groom. No legal evidence had been got, but the tradition had remained. "They used to tell us when we were children," said my host in a hoarse voice, "and to frighten my cousin, I mean my wife, and me with stories about Lovelock. It is merely a tradition, which I hope may die out, as I sincerely pray to Heaven that it may be false. Alice, Mrs. Oke, you see," he went on after some time, "doesn't feel about it as I do. Perhaps I am morbid, but I do dislike having the old story raked up." And we said no more on the subject. End of chapter 2.